In the year 1966, specifically on July 14, the people of an area in Chicago woke up to hysterical screaming from the nurse's home near them. The neighbors rushed to it while many of them called the police. Everyone was surprised to find Nurse Corazon Amureo standing on the edge of one of the windows upstairs and screaming hysterically for help, so a group of neighborhood men broke into the house to help rescue the poor nurse. The scene inside was even more horrifying. The bodies of female nurses who lived in the dormitory were lying here and there. Everyone froze in front of the terrifying scene, and the police quickly came and helped the nurse get down, amidst everyone's astonishment. Corazon was the only one who could make them understand what happened inside the house. The police imposed a security perimeter around the place, and they took Corazon to the hospital, where they did not find any physical injuries, but she was in a very bad psychological condition. Investigators headed to the house to remove the bodies and attempt to search the crime scene. The police were able to reach the scene of the break-in on the ground floor. It was a window and a knife used by the attacker was lying next to it, but the question was, who is the intruder? Is it one person or more? The police waited for Corazon to calm down because she was the only witness to that massacre. Corazon is a Filipino nurse who came as part of an academic exchange with a group of her colleagues to South Chicago Hospital, and they stayed with a group of their American colleagues in the nurse's residence near the hospital. The nurse told the police that on the day of the accident, she returned home at 9 p.m. as usual, and then went to her room. At 10:30, she heard a knock on her door, so she thought it was one of her housemates. But she was surprised by a stranger pointing a gun at her and asking her to move with him in silence. Carl moved with him in great fear as he headed to another room, where she found 6 of her colleagues inside. The intruder told them that he didn't want to hurt any of them, he just needed the money. The poor women collected everything they owned, but the amount did not exceed $20. The nurses were then surprised by the intruder removing the bedsheets and cutting them into long strips, then handcuffing each nurse individually. But soon he heard a voice downstairs announcing the arrival of other nurses from the residents of the residence, so he quickly went down and then came back dragging another nurse, and while she was being tied, the last 2 nurses returned to the house, so he led them as well, but to another room, and then suddenly silence prevailed. Here the miserable nurses felt that something scary was happening in the other room. Then the intruder returned to them to take another girl, and the nurses did not know what was happening to her, as his exit was followed by complete silence. Thus, the attacker continued to drag one girl after another, and those who were taken would never return. They were 8 nurses. Corazon was the last, so she hid under the bed, praying to God that the killer had forgotten how many of them there were. Suddenly, the intruder entered the room, but this time he was searching inside the nurses' bags for money or anything valuable, then left. Read also, Abu Tabar, the butcher of Baghdad, the head smasher. The nurse remained under the bed in silence and terror, not knowing what was happening or what happened outside the room, until the room owner's alarm went off at exactly 5:30 in the morning. She hesitated to go out, as she did not know where the killer was or what he was preparing for her. Then she gathered her courage and decided to leave her hiding place. She silently crept out of the room after she was able to untie her hands to find horror waiting for her outside, the bodies of her friends lying here and there in a state of disrepair. She was afraid to go all the way outside, so she returned to her room and climbed out the window to scream as the residents of the area found her. Corazon was able to describe the serial killer and added a very important piece of information. She saw a tattoo on his hands that read, "Born to Raise Hell." The police circulated the descriptions of the serial killer who killed 8 people. Nurses were stabbed, strangled, and one of them was raped across the country. The response came from a place near the nurse's home, where the police found a photo of one of the job applicants very similar to the description given by Corazon. The police took the photo and went to the surviving nurse, who confirmed beyond any doubt that he was the killer. But who is this criminal? The serial killer who committed this heinous massacre is 24-year-old Richard Speck, who recently moved to Chicago from Texas to escape his criminal history, which contains 40 different crimes, ranging from theft to assault. Richard was born on December 6, 1941 in the state of Illinois, the seventh of 8 children. His father, to whom he was deeply attached, died of a heart attack when he was 6, and years later, in 1950, his mother remarried and moved with her husband to Dallas, taking Richard and his younger sister with her. The two were often verbally and physically abused by their drunken stepfather. As a result, Richard Speck began drinking alcohol at an early age. He was first arrested when he was 13, and left school 3 years later. In 1962, he married a girl named Shirley Malone. Their baby girl was born shortly thereafter, and the marriage ended in divorce in 1966. Returning to the case, Richard's fingerprints from his security file were matched to the fingerprints inside the nurse's home, and the fingerprints matched with certainty. The search for Richard Speck began, until a strange coincidence came from a simple hotel, where a worker called the police to tell them that he had found a client inside his room who had attempted suicide. The ambulance quickly set off for the hotel, and when it arrived, the doctor recognized Richard's features, who quickly called the police from his location. The police approached Corazon asking her to come to the hospital to identify Richard Speck. Corazon agreed without hesitation in order to obtain the rights of her colleagues. Indeed, she went to the hospital and stood face to face in front of the killer, screaming that he was the same intruder, the killer who killed her colleagues. Richard was referred to trial amid police fear that Corazon would recant his testimony due to her psychological state. But her family came from the Philippines to support her, so she was able to courageously confront the killer again inside the courtroom. Richard Speck was sentenced to death by electric chair, but he died a natural death in December 1991 after spending 25 years in prison. As for Nurse Corazon Amureo, she lived a normal life with her husband, children, and grandchildren.